So who knows what blockchain is? By a show of hands. Just, if you don't, it's fine. Who knows what blockchain is? Okay, there's two people. So blockchain is a new type of technology that works on what's called the distributed ledger technology. So for those who are good in accounting, it's said to be a system that does three main things. Number one, it's transparent, such that no transaction that is done can be changed without that change being noticed. Number two, it means that there is no central controller of the data or the transaction. So normally how transaction data is processed is you have a server. So you have information that goes through one party who controls the information and then sends it out. For distributed ledger technology, it's exactly that. It's distributed. It's not one person controlling the information, which means everyone with access to the ledger can see every transaction that's taking place. But secondly, everyone participates in the dissemination and distribution and storage of that information. So there is something they call nodes. So instead of a centralized server, each of the parties on the platform have like a piece of the information with a special signature, which then comes together to form the whole. So instead of, say, sending information to this computer and then I send information to each one of you, the information is disaggregated and each one of you have a piece of it. Think, how many of you like those puzzles where the little pieces come and maybe it's a goat or a forest or something and you're supposed to put it together? So think of information that way, that instead of it starting as having been fixed at the beginning, you have little pieces and each one of you has a piece that then comes together. So if each one of you has a piece that has a signature that is attached to you, if someone tries to change it, it will be obvious. So the benefits of blockchain are that it's transparent, it's what they call immutable, which means if you try and sort of change, the error will be obvious or the information chain will break. But it also democratizes information. I think to some extent, blockchain itself is not as revolutionary as distributed ledger technology in the energy system. And I'm going to explain why. You see, so blockchain is based on distributed ledger, what I've told you. So blockchain is one of the ways in which distributed ledger technologies happen. How many of you have heard of cryptocurrencies? So cryptocurrencies are also one of the use cases of distributed ledger technology or blockchain technology. So the whole idea is to democratize how systems work. So like for cryptocurrencies, the idea was instead of having banks control financial systems, that people should create a separate, more democratized financial system. There are a few problems with cryptocurrencies, which I'm not going to get into now, but the underlying technology that allows cryptocurrencies to work is blockchain technology. So in energy systems, how does this apply? Here, when it comes to metering, there can be, instead of waiting for data from your energy supplier, you can have information exchange. So if Pranjul has excess energy on a Friday night, this sounds like it's normal, he has excess energy on a Friday night, but if he has excess electricity on a Friday night, and Remia lacks, she needs 10 units to cook, you can have a metering exchange where then you can exchange the surplus energy without using a centralized party. So energy systems of the future, say in your village, someone is away and they've paid for energy and that they're not using, and someone else has overused their units, you can have an exchange. So these are some of the things. So data exchange between stakeholders of smart grid application. So I've picked users, but now imagine that at a broader scale, that your utility company in Karnataka, maybe they're relying on wind energy and they don't have enough to supply. You remember the little curves that I showed you? So if the electricity company does not have enough power, but not Uttar Pradesh, I think that's a bit far. Kerala, yeah. So Kerala has surplus. They can then exchange that information and balance the grid. You remember the example I gave of Germany, Romania, and the Netherlands? So if they could exchange information real time, it would be easier to balance grids across. There's grid management, is what I've just explained. There's decentralized generation of electricity. There's electric vehicle charging. So if they use blockchain technology there, you can have what are called smart contracts. How contracts generally work is you need 3 or 4 elements for a contract to be valid. Number one, you need at least more than one party. 2, you need for those contracts up to very recently to be written. And if the contracts aren't written, there's something they call the meeting of the minds. It needs to be clear that you both understood what you are getting yourselves into. Number 3, there must be something called consideration, which means exchange for value. So I give you money in exchange for your water bottle, or I give you my pen in exchange for your earrings. So there must be consideration. There is no valid contract if there is no value exchanged. And some contracts need to be witnessed, like land transactions and so on. Of course. Yeah, so now these two stakeholders may not even need to sit down and negotiate. You can set down parameters and say, if my electricity units fall below 10, I shall buy electricity at $3 for the deficit. And anybody on the system who has those units can supply that electricity to you, and that is a smart contract. So the reason it's a smart contract, all these elements of offer, acceptance, consideration, the meeting of the minds, all that becomes automated. So you can have contracts that are real-time, instant, and without the whole negotiation process and so on. So you'll hear a lot about blockchain and its use cases and how it will transform the world and energy systems in whichever field you are. Whether you go into finance, you'll hear about blockchain. Whether you go into healthcare, if you just Google blockchain, and you'll see a lot of use cases. So I think it's just necessary for a class such as this one. If we're going to talk about technology, we cannot miss to talk about blockchain. I personally believe there is no panacea. There is no single solution that will wave a magic wand that will work for everything. You remember all the environmental factors we spoke about, the cultural factors. Sometimes even the best suited technologies don't work because they're not accepted. But blockchain has some fabulous use cases, and you'll hear a lot about this as we move along. So when you are, your drawings, by the way, I think there should be a round of applause for the hand of God thing, because in art, apparently drawing hands is one of the most difficult things. And this is what the Romans used to sort of, if you look at their sculptures and so on, like the best sculptures, if the hands are right, it's usually considered a masterpiece. So well done. Anyway, so back to technology. Nuclear fusion. So what we have at the moment in the nuclear industry is nuclear fission, which means you take the atoms and break them down, usually from a radioactive material like uranium or plutonium, usually uranium. So you break this down. The problem with that is that you have extremely toxic waste. But nuclear fission may work using breaking down elements that are not radioactive to extract, say, hydrogen from them, and water is a good example. So nuclear fusion is said to create the possibility of transforming energy systems because it will generate clean energy. It will generate an extremely high, what we call a capacity factor. I think I mentioned this in the first or second class. Like if a coal power plant is commissioned to produce 1 gigawatt, usually there are two problems. The output is never 1 gigawatt. 1 gigawatt is the maximum. But secondly, there's the ratio of the fuel to the output. So for most sources of energy, if you put in, say, 100 grams of coal, you would expect, say, 100 kilowatts of electricity. I'm just giving an example. You will probably get 40% at best of it. But for nuclear, that usually hovers way higher than that, maybe in the 90s, in the 90% range. So nuclear energy itself as an energy source is not polluting to the environment when it comes to climate change, carbon intensity, but it has serious problems in its value chain in terms of nuclear waste. But nuclear fusion, if it's breaking down water, for example, into its respective elements, then it can transform energy systems. However, who foresees a slight problem here? So imagine radioactivity, the amount of energy generated is insane. If there were to be any problem, so still questions on accidents are quite high, but in terms of just the capacity of what nuclear fusion can do, it's incredible. The reason it's not gotten to an industrial scale at the moment are questions of safety. Because what you do, you create these atoms to be in an extremely unstable state so that they generate a lot of heat so that you get your energy. So creating this unstable environment in a controlled environment is why nuclear fusion has not taken off. But if nuclear fusion works, I think we'll see energy systems of the future completely transformed. Are there any questions so far? Battery storage. Remember, one of the greatest problems, I mentioned this in the second class, was that once energy is generated, not in the second class, I think the class where Sam was here, once energy is generated, the storage capacity now is limited, so it cannot be stored for a long time. And that's why centralized energy systems, people try and match demand with supply. I'll repeat that so that we're on the same page. So when demand increases, what energy systems do is simply to increase supply. But if there were energy storage, especially for renewables, remember the curve that I gave you, that the sun shines sometimes when the energy demand is lowest. If that energy could be stored, and not for an hour or 2 or 3, but if battery storage, if energy could be stored for much longer periods, then we would not need to ramp up supply to match demand. We'd simply store energy and use it when we need. So battery storage is one of the, I believe, looking at some of the technologies that I've seen and working with a few startups and some universities, we are getting really, really close to longer term storage of energy. However, we've had several problems. One, we've needed really large batteries. If you think of your phone can be charged and recharged repeatedly for about how long? How many of you have had a mobile phone for more than 4 years? Have you noticed a downgrade? Oh, let's see by a show of hands. One person in the room, my goodness. How many of you have had a phone for more than 3 or 4 years? 3, yeah, 3, give or take. Sorry? Or the phone exists, but it's not in use. Did you notice a drop in the battery? And if you used a mobile phone maybe 10 years ago, you would notice the difference. One, in the size of the thing. So batteries, of course, are getting smaller and more efficient, but we also have problems there. The material that goes into batteries, once the batteries run out, it's hazardous waste, number one. Number two, how your phone battery works is not how a larger battery works. So the reason your phone battery works the way it does is because it's used in a smaller, the use case for it is smaller. So, but I believe battery storage will make a huge difference. How? It will power buildings, will help in storage of renewable energy. And if you just look at that, if you have wind, when the wind doesn't blow, you store the energy. And so if you look at something like this, it means that we may not necessarily need to invest in fossil fuels. So always think of this class as moving back to the just transition. So what does technology mean for the just transition? Can we then transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies with battery storage? The answer is yes, but also remember the class on mining. A lot of the elements that go into batteries are mined. And so always think of the energy cycle, such that even if batteries do actually become commercially viable, what are the other impacts of battery storage? Where will the battery waste go to? Are we changing the material that goes into batteries? I know some people are now using solid state batteries and so on, things that are different from lithium ion batteries. So battery storage is another thing.
I have a question about battery storage.
Yes.
As you said, battery we get the energy from renewable kinds of. So can we also, for example, we have no 356 days with the sun weather.
Yes.
And of course we have cloudy, rainy, and we have no sunshine some days. What we shall do with these days?
This is where battery storage comes in. Think if your battery could hold the power that you charged it once for a year, it means you would need to charge your battery once a year. And that's precisely the point. That right now, battery storage is used largely for distributed energy, where you have a solar panel and a small battery, or pico grids, like maybe 5 or 10 homes, or microgrids. So we have the centralized grid, which is what you're used to, and then we have a mini grid, which is a smaller grid, say powers a small village. Then we have a microgrid that powers maybe 4 or 5 homes, and we have a pico grid that maybe powers your chicken lighting and your cow shed. It's smaller. So pico is just the smallest energy grid that you can set up at the moment. So if battery storage were there longer term, because right now, even these home batteries for solar panels are like your phone. You store electricity for just a few hours. If those batteries had the capacity to store energy much longer, it would work precisely for the scenario you're giving. Because it means when the sun doesn't shine, when the wind doesn't blow, you'll just get power from your battery. And when it blows, you will not need to immediately use it. You can continue using what's in the battery as it continues to charge. So battery storage actually is one of the things that people are saying, look, this will transform energy systems of the future. So energy storage, whether it's battery or other forms. Because remember, when I used the example of hydro, because when we think of technology, let's not just think of, like the next few slides, like the internet, like using a river to just dam the water. When you need electricity, you release the water and it turns the turbines. at will, you're using natural resources as a battery. You're looking at me like I'm speaking a different language. Have you understood that point? Okay, good. The energy levels today are still not good, but I want you to think about what you envisioned for the future and the things that are being done now that may shape the energy system of the future.
Is snow harvesting slow as a thing?
I do not know what you're talking about.
Like you could soak the snow, then convert the water, collect the water, and use it as a form of energy.
Okay, that sounds quite interesting in a variety of ways. Number one, for fresh water, and two, for energy. So probably, but how do you keep, because we know water freezes give or take at about 0 degrees without impurities. So how do you keep that water in that semi-solid or solid state?
Like the roofs can be turned into like heated panels with direct.
You're talking about now countries that are colder.
Yeah.
I thought you like storage of snow.
No.
And then, yeah, so I was just thinking the energy to freeze the snow and take it. And I ask this question not because I'm being stupid, but if you look at how, say, medicines are transported around the world, ice is one of the most valued. There are people who, in terms of fish and medicines, their main business is ice. Just having either ice trucks or supplying ice in small packs to transport these things. So it's not an entirely stupid thing. But that sounds like a brilliant idea. This is the first time I've heard about it. So, but if I just think about it, it makes some form of sense. Anyone else with any comment or question? Okay, who knows what the Internet of Things is? The ones with their hands up, please explain. And then someone from this side, if you do, you can explain as well.
I don't have an amazing understanding, but it's basically like all of these smart devices, like your fridge can connect to the internet, your light bulb can connect to the internet, and how you can use like a centralized system, say within your home, to control all of these devices, and they can all interact with each other for different purposes.
Okay, that's any different view?
I also can add that IoT is based on sensors, like a huge number of sensors everywhere that control temperature, any other, all the other qualities, and you all the time can control how you control and check how it changes and so on. But yes, in general, it's not.
So we'll go back to the drawing of robotics. The internet is basically a network of information exchange, and that's a very rudimentary way of explaining it. The Internet of Things is this network now being transformed into the physical realm. So if you think of driverless cars, it's the internet controlling, and hence the sensors that Pavel was talking about, controlling how your car moves and turns and so on. It's on the way here. At Heathrow, I saw one of these robots cleaning the floor. It was the most interesting sight. Like, this robot came and my friend walked in front of it and it took a corner around them and continued cleaning the floor. It left a patch. So I'm not sure whether it will get to the end and have OCD and come back to clean. But that's an example of the Internet of Things, where the Internet now has a physical controlling element in everyday life. So driverless cars are one. Pavel has given various examples. Robotics is another. So what can the energy sector do with the Internet of Things? An example is if you're right here and you think, oh my goodness, I left the kettle on. You could simply go to an app and click switch off, socket number this. Or if you get a notification that electricity is cheapest now, you could have left clothes in the washing machine and just click Alternatively, you don't need to click. If an algorithm, which is the next slide I'll show you, says that when electricity is cheapest, heat my home or warm my food, then it would simply do that. So you suddenly have the internet connecting this information to cause a transformation in energy systems. Now that's you. Think of the utility company and what that can do for balancing of not just the grid, but distribution of energy. Think about how data can then be used to channel certain resources within energy systems. Think of potential blackouts or in times of disaster, where maybe energy can be isolated to be taken to hospitals, to say, pharmaceutical facilities. So when you think of the Internet of Things, think of the Internet automatically having a physical impact. And driverless cars are the best example, and robotics. So when you imagine energy systems of the future and what can happen in your country, these are things that are happening now. I'm not a big fan of Teslas, but Teslas now have sort of driverless cars. They've had a few accidents, but they are quite impressive in some respects. I've seen a few videos. So we are really close. We're not talking about 50 years away. The IoT is what right now. People are doing some of these things. There are most homes now most is a bit of an exaggeration. Many homes in the UK have smart meters. You can actually determine set certain parameters when your heating should come on and so on. So this is already happening. It's now a question of globalizing it and energy systems working like this. Artificial intelligence, but before we go to artificial intelligence, there is one thing about battery storage. So imagine if your car was also your energy supplier. I gave you the example of park and charge, and so you can sort of use your car if it has excess charge to then power appliances in your home, and then you charge the car when it's cheapest. And many cars are just parked. Like this, there's quite a bit of research going on. Most people use their car for a commute. They park the car, and then they pick it up in the evening. While parking, if you had 200,000 cars, if that could be used like major battery storage, that then powers, say, an office building. And then just before everyone sort of goes home, when electricity is cheap at around lunchtime, they're then recharged. So these are some of the uses. But one of the biggest problems with electric cars, at least the fears, especially in the US, is that some of these batteries, the more powerful they become, the more likely they are to be like little bombs. Like, you can have fires and so on. It's a bit of a stretch, but I think it's important to introduce some of the challenges. Why aren't these things used if the technology is there? There are concerns of different kinds with each of these technologies. And so, who knows what artificial intelligence is?
Of course.
Exactly. Okay, who took the course on artificial intelligence? Show of hands. Everybody?
Except
Okay, God bless. What is artificial intelligence?
A fair idea about it is like developing an algorithm where the technological gadgets are able to operate on their own with acquiring some intelligence from the environment and operating on their own without necessarily being monitored all the time.
That's a good explanation. Who knows what an algorithm is?
it's a set of codes
Yes.
that we use to program the artificial brain.
Good. So the explanation was good, but for some people, if someone doesn't know what an algorithm is, the explanation wouldn't make sense. sense, but that's a very good explanation. Anyone with a different explanation? So, of artificial intelligence.
So, a set of human instructions while given to a supercomputer or a set of code or patterns when designed in a manner that the machine itself learns and provides feedback and learnings as and is capable of human interaction, is capable of human level of thinking and processing stuff, could be categorized in terms.
How many of you have heard of ChatGPT?
We discussed.
You discussed it in class. How many of you are using ChatGPT?
Used it.
Or they have used ChatGPT? Show of hands.
Yeah.
How many of you were impressed by ChatGPT? How many of you were unimpressed by ChatGPT? Okay, let's start with the unimpressed. Jamia.
Yeah, basically, we use that in class, like for an, we use that in the ethics of artificial intelligence class. So we used to do some of this academic writing that ChatGPT do. So basically, they say that it won't be showing that it is plagiarized when we take some of these things from ChatGPT. So there are some ethical concerns regarding that. So people use this as a medium to get academic sources without plagiarism.
An unfair advantage.
Yeah, that's an unethical thing, I think. Yeah.
Like this.
It's also diminishing creativity in that sense. The whole, even like artificial intelligence, one of the, I think the drawbacks that we were talking about was the limitation of creativity. I think there was a trend last month that was like painting your face in terms of this artificial apps, but then real painters were claiming that this was taking autonomy from the real painting.
Some information looks very real, but they are not real. Just use as it is real. Easily use some data with dates and some info. I see this like modern days Aladdin and magic lamp. It gives whatever you want, like that. But it's I mean it's not as of now it's not fully real.
Yeah, they give made-up stories. If we ask about something, they also give some made-up stories. That's what we learned from the class as well.
Yeah,
It is not updated.
yeah,
It is not.
updated.
Oh, it's not updated. Okay.
yeah, it's still a beta version.
There's a lot of material you've just said there. It's done.
The main problem I have with it is that it's just like an information machine. It's like Google, but it makes stuff up. It's not able to, like if you're chatting with it, it can't hold a conversation. It's not like one of those AIs which you can have a conversation. It can't respond in that way. It just says, oh, I can only give you information and nothing else. So it's like Google that can chat. I mean,
I think that
Books is a huge library where you can by yourself find information. But this chat, he gives you an essence of this information. It's already done. You should copy paste it. That's it.
No,
But check it.
yeah, check it.
I disagree with what.
So it's, you're still doing the work. If you're checking it again, then you're still doing the work.
Disagree, and then let's hear something from this side on artificial intelligence. Anything. So prepare yourselves. Yes.
Yeah, so that's all I'm saying, that in relation to this point, that creativity, creative persons seek ideas or inspiration from certain things, and if you have the right inputs to provide to artificial intelligence, like I wrote that give me a song by Tupac if he was born in Delhi, and it was able to this was given in I heard Joe Rogan talk about it in his podcast, that it is enabled to do certain stuff which normal humans won't be able to do. So you have to seek inspiration. It's a helping aid. It's not something that you can completely rely upon, but it's a helping aid.
Let's interrogate that further. I gave you an example that when I joined the law firm, longer than I want to admit, one of the things that stood out for me was the ability to support an argument by finding a case, even if it's from the 1500s. So of course, if I was given a piece of research and told the client wants to go prove this in court, please find a supporting authority, I will find one. But now Dr. Google can do that for me in 0.00001 seconds, and not just give me one authority, give me like 200,000 results. ChatGPT can then use that database to give me 3 paragraphs of an argument with the best of those 3 cases. But what does that mean for me? Does that limit my creativity, or it frees my time to do things that are slightly more meaningful that a machine cannot do? For example, sit down with a client and reassure them about the case, deal with the more psychological elements. Because remember, when we talk about artificial intelligence, I don't think we're there yet. Because if ChatGPT is the global use case for the best AI has achieved at the moment, we have a long way to go. Is there any comment from this side? I saw you were any comment on artificial intelligence? Any use of ChatGPT? Any fears? I think I'll show you something. To lighten up your mood.
If 2 factors one, yeah, I wrote it and I was mind.
Hi.
Want to build your website but confused? Worry not, let Big Rock come to your rescue.
Is this the one? Yeah, maybe the English. Yeah, let's try this one.
Playing jazz.
Playing jazz.
Smoothie.
Making smoothie.
Calendar.
No meetings today. Remember, tandläkare at 9:30.
Fire off.
Fire off.
Open door.
Door open.
Sånn. Så skal vi sette en til.
Ja. Open door.
Wrong voice command.
Open door.
Wrong voice command.
Open door.
Repeat that.
Open door.
I didn't understand that.
Hey, open door.
Play on the floor.
Sit on the floor.
Get on the floor. Open the door. Open the door.
Error.
Hey, hvor er det? Open door. Open door.
So, you can go watch the rest of that. So these are some of the fears that people have, that machines will make decisions for you to your detriment. Of course, it's an advert, it's hyperbolic, it's a little funny, but when we talk about artificial intelligence, we are not there yet. That's just, and artificial intelligence means that machines can process and then learn from processes to then make automated decisions. What we have at the moment is machine learning. So ChatGPT in 2 years will be far better. Who can guess why?
Because of the responses that we are providing.
So it's learning and getting a larger database and seeing the patterns with which people are, asking things. So at the moment, what we have is machine learning. But artificial intelligence is something humans have been building up toward. And I think the best AI machine has responded with the aptitude of about a 6-year-old. And the supercomputing required for that has been incredible. But the more information machines get, the more they learn. How many of you did the ethical questions on this artificial intelligence? So how about, because machines learn from us, what kind of content do people put out on social media or out on the internet? How much of it is actually a reflection of the truth? And how much of it is bitter and unkind? Like sometimes I go on Twitter and I just close it. Because someone would even tweet, such a beautiful day. And someone will come with a neo-political argument about, and you think, my goodness, why? Because when humans are behind walls and you give them an internet connection and freedom, sometimes what is put on display are not the realities of the full human experience. And one of the most petrifying things about artificial intelligence is that if what's being used is what's being put out on the internet, then it's not a true reflection of human society. Like if aliens were to come in now and just scour the internet, they would think we are selfie-taking, TikTok video. I mean, they'd think humans are just a really strange breed of humans, of creatures, really. Because what's put out on the internet sometimes is not a reflection. And so with artificial intelligence, it works as best as the information that's fed off it. Yeah, so it probably also, as he says, is the true reflection. So there are all these things that we need to think about. But what can artificial intelligence do? It builds up on the Internet of Things. So once the internet begins to transform our physical world, artificial intelligence can then automate it and learn from it and decide without the algorithm or the parameters. And decide, look, your house is heated optimally between 9 and 10 p.m. because you never come home before 9 p.m. So it's wasting electricity if your house is heated anytime before that. So artificial intelligence takes the Internet of Things to the next level. And in energy systems, all the benefits that you can get through blockchain and the Internet of Things will then be automated beyond what parameters you can feed the... Yes?
I don't know if this is a quick question, but do you think it's easy to educate humans to save energy than educating your own artificial intelligence to quantify?
The short answer is yes on one-on-one, but systemic, no. Because there's something called information asymmetry in economics. So if you only make decisions or good decisions based on the information you have, you only know a limited amount of things, including about your energy use. Because how we interact, there's something called haptic feedback. Like just typing on a keyboard, that the sound, the clicks. Some research has been done about temperatures in a room, like in a lecture theater. Different people have different warmth tolerances. And a 1 degree difference can make a huge difference on how you feel. You'll think it's maybe 5-10 degrees hotter. So what people do is overcompensate. But if a machine probably knows your optimal sleeping temperature is 19 degrees, can do that. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine worked in the US, and he worked for one of these companies that was supplying, I think, software to supermarkets. And you'll find a similar story in, have you read, not Bankman Fried's book, where he gives an example of one of these call centers placed a phone call to his house and called the daughter. And they were trying to sell child products, diapers, and so on to the child. Well, when I say child, she was, I think, 15 or 16 years old. And the guy took the phone and lambasted the person who'd called and said, "How dare you? How dare you try and market children products to someone who's a minor?" And so the guy apologized and hung up. But in call centers, they use algorithms. So you're given a profile and products that match that you should sell to them. 3 months later, the dad called the call center and asked, "How did you know my daughter was pregnant?" Because from her shopping patterns, from her surfing patterns, they could tell that that pattern is consistent with a pregnant woman. And so they started marketing these products to her even before she knew she was pregnant. So the question here is it easier to educate people than machines? Is a really complex question. I think one cultural change on a larger scale is very difficult to achieve. And educating people depends on a variable of factors. The person educating, communication, whether this person wants to learn or not. There's a huge range of factors. Like, you made the decision to come to this class this morning with the intention that hopefully you'll learn something. If I came to this class unprepared, there's so many variables in trying to teach people, and the information asymmetry and so on. Cloud computing. Remember the example I gave you at the beginning of the class about a server? So when you think of the cloud, let someone give us an example. Who knows what cloud computing is? Remia, explain to us.
Yeah, so basically, through cloud computing, you can access your data from anywhere from the world. It's not like you have to use your own desktop environment. It can be stored in the cloud. You can access it from anywhere.
Yeah, that's true. It can be stored in the cloud. And the whole idea of the cloud is it's floating. You can access it from anywhere. But that information is stored on a server somewhere. So instead of you having a hard drive like we have here, there's someone with a hard drive somewhere who allows you access at any time. Most of the technology major companies now are the largest energy consumers. Why? Because of this, and because of the servers that are required. If you see there, cloud computing servers. Some of these servers need two things. Number one, they need extreme cooling, because with the higher the processing power, the more the heat is generated. And this is the reason a lot of men are asked not to have laptops on their laps, even though the name is a laptop, for obvious reasons, because you will fry. So if your laptop generates that heat to process the little information that's going there, imagine information on a much larger scale. So these servers need cooling. The amount of cooling that they needs energy. For these servers to run those processes the way they do, they need vast amounts of energy to run. So cloud computing has these benefits, but cloud computing is extremely energy intensive and extremely energy intensive to power and to cool. So unless these servers have better processing power, energy efficiency, and cooling, it's going to be one of the major problems, because it's not just for energy systems, because these servers are used for many things. This has become such a huge problem that now companies like Google, Microsoft have direct power purchase agreements from energy companies. They set up like a huge solar farm where they buy all the power. That was never contemplated before. And what happened? What happened is that now, instead of energy generation companies selling power to countries, they're selling power directly to Microsoft and Google, which has led to the emergence of new legal instruments. There are what are called power purchase agreements, but now private power purchase agreements by energy companies specifically. So each of these solutions, as you can see, create their own sets of problems. But energy systems of the future will combine various elements of this. By the way, in terms of artificial intelligence, what we have now is largely machine learning. We haven't really gotten to the point of artificial intelligence that works autonomously the way it should. I can see you are tired. So, I had put this up previously, a long time ago. And what should guide decision making when we are saying, okay, we'll have this technology or that technology, or we'll implement this? There's availability. So energy. People deserve sufficient energy resources in high quality. And so what do we need to do? We need to invest. Affordability. The provision of energy services, we should not just look at this as a commodity. So, but what should we do? End energy poverty. Due process, involve people. So here it talks about countries should respect due process and human rights and so on, but just involve people and respect the environment. Transparency and accountability. Energy decision making cannot be effective if people are unaware. And this is one of the reasons I am laboring to pass on as much information and to have you engage different perspectives, because without the right information, you cannot have due process. I'll give you an example. If you are arrested in, how many people here can speak Spanish? By a show of hands. So if you are, anyone? I do not know why, but these two always seem to have the answers, but they don't speak. But imagine you're arrested. Yes, imagine you're arrested and then the trial starts. It follows every rule of the law, but is conducted in Spanish. This is exactly how sometimes energy systems tend to function. That because people are unaware, even things that are supposed to follow the process to the letter and are legal have unintended outcomes. So sustainability is important. Intragenerational equity is about amongst ourselves, and intergenerational equity is about future generations. So intragenerational equity is about what I showed you about energy disparity around the world. I'm not saying that you should consume the same as a person in the US, but your grandmother should have at least a minimum standard of dignity. Intergenerational equity is about, should we deplete and spoil the environment so the people who come after us will not enjoy? I mean, I come from a country where we have the last white rhino on Earth. And we know it's going to be extinct because I think there's one female left, or two females. I grew up seeing these rhinos. I've seen these two rhinos in Laikipia, the last ones on Earth. I'm hoping that somewhere, because Africa is a vast place, that maybe somewhere in South Sudan or somewhere, we probably have a rhino that someone hasn't tagged. But if that's not the case, they're going extinct. Off the coast of Scotland where I was, there were whales. People could see whales in the early noughties. Right now, I think orcas, these black whales with a spot, I think there are only 8 left now. So spotting them is rare beyond belief. So we are seeing a change where some of the things we enjoy now will not be there in future. So then comes responsibility. So why does law matter in decision making? I don't think I've shown you this slide. This is from 2019. On the left-hand side is the energy mix, different energy sources, as at 2018. On the right-hand side were projections to 2040. And these projections are based on policy, energy law and policy choices. So oil, based on the current policy frameworks, there'll be an increase in oil use by 2040. There will be an increase in natural gas use by 2040. Coal will reduce marginally by 2040. Other renewables will increase by a lot, from about 300 units there to 1,300, but still, comparatively, will not make the transition. Modern bioenergy, so biofuels will increase marginally. Nuclear will increase by very little. Solid biomass will decrease, and hydro will increase by very little. And this is using two parameters: law and policy decisions. And these were thought to be ambitious at the time. That even with marginally ambitious policy decisions, will not make the transition by 2040. And that's why I keep saying law is important, because it then sets the foundation for certain decisions that have to be made and resources to be channeled. About 7 people in class are like this. So we will take a break, even though we had voted against a break. I would like you to probably walk out, take a drink, come back in, not a stiff drink, Sergey, you've laughed. Come back here. I'm not going to explain this again, but I said law matters, and law matters at all these levels. But there's one thing that I want you to remember. The aims and the principles we've been talking about throughout don't change whether you're at a local council or you're at a UN conference. And some of you, after here, some of you will land in the international arena. Some of you will be in the national arena, like the MP for Assam. Some of you might have some provincial work to do. Some of you may have local work to do, and others, like we saw, was it yesterday? You can actually just make a difference in your home, and then your home can inspire thousands of girls from around the place. So wherever you are, there are legal decisions to be made, and there are policy decisions to be made at each of these levels. The aim of this class was to introduce you to expand your thinking on what elements don't change across this chain. Like what are our aims, what are the principles, and in the just energy transition. So this is why this slide is there. I'll not explain it again. Also remember that the mechanics of how these places work are different. You know, how the principle may be the same, but how Parliament works is not the same way as your home works. You probably have greater autonomy in the home. In Parliament, you may need to trade off some things so that your bill passes. At international level, the same thing happens. So understanding the mechanics of decision making and power should not change your principles, is basically what I'm trying to say. And understanding what happens at each of these levels makes you far more efficient and effective, not just as the decision maker, but the person pushing for certain decisions to happen. Whether you're an activist, an artist, knowing what levers to pull to ensure that decisions go a certain way or the other in an international conference is not the same way as you would do it in your local authority or in your home. So just understanding what makes these cogs move is really important. So I'll finally just go over energy and finance. Throughout the classes, there are certain slides that have been touching on energy and finance. The first one is lobbying. Money has the ability to move certain political decisions. This is a fact around the world. And this is especially stark in the US. And that was years ago. Now, an assignment that you can undertake is just have a look in your country, have a look in the US, and have a look in Europe, in the UK, and see how much money is used to lobby. One of the best sources of information, when companies are listed in any exchange, whether it's a securities exchange or a stock exchange, they have to publish every year their financials. And in their financials, if you have a look, you can see how much money goes to things like research and development, because all the things we have discussed today on technology need investment. How many of you can guess in terms of percentages how much major energy companies use of their revenue for research and development? A percentage. Guess. Take a wild guess. He's 40%, he says. 20, less than 10 maybe. From this side, it's guessing. You can guess any number between 0 and 100. So, sorry? 30. As at the last check, it was 1% or less. 1. So if there were a requirement in law for there to be research and development, or if the government were, from the taxes that they levy, would use 10% of those taxes to plow back into research and development, the energy transition will be accelerated quicker. Or if there were to be some form of tax break, which some people would argue that's a bit of a problem to some of these companies, if they undertook research and development demonstrably, you'll see an uptake in some of these technologies. So one thing, lobbying, money makes a difference. And I can tell you this, I used to work near a reasonably fancy mall in Nairobi. And on weekends, I liked to walk or sometimes, take an Uber, and on other days I'd drive there. On the days that I walked, they would search me they would almost perform a cavity search, because malls have very tight security in Kenya. But if you drove a car, especially a certain type of car, they'll be, how are you, sir? Do you want to park in the shade? So, and we see this in everyday interactions, and we see this in far more serious levels. If you think of countries with more money, they have more power in international platforms. If you think of companies with more money, they have more power than even the governments that govern them. So lobbying. I asked a question, which I'll probably repeat that slide here. If you got the financial resources, or if you're in a position to control vast amounts of money, how would you spend it? How would you use that position to push the transition to a better world? So lobbying, so finances have an impact when it's simple lobbying. Second thing is that investment. Even a billionaire, the scale of change required to transform energy systems, a billionaire's billions would not be enough. This is one of the things I really wanted this class to pick out. That if this guy gives away his money, the richest person, who knows who the richest person in the world is as of 2023? Sorry? Yes, no, it's not. Bezos was knocked off. It's the Louis Vuitton guy. Renard Arnault. Yeah. So you can look that up. He's worth, Forbes claimed 100 billion. 100 billion is not enough. To transform EU infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, they need about 1.3 trillion euro. So you can see, and that's a developed market already where people have access to electricity. So if you had the money, it's not just about investment, it's also about using that power to influence things. And we can see some people doing this with devastating effect. There are foundations that have been set up by billionaires that are determining global health policy, that are determining security, that are determining where arms will be sold, who will get vaccines, and so on. So think of these as a platform through which power is then disseminated. So what would you invest in is a really important question. And one answer that was given from this side of the room was on other aspects apart from energy, because energy is generated not for energy's sake. So that is the Louis Vuitton guy. And he became a billionaire, guess when? No, he did, no, not he, sorry, he became the wealthiest person. He was a billionaire already. When? During the pandemic. So people bought luxury goods over the pandemic more than they ever have, despite the fact that people weren't going anywhere. So they bought, Louis Vuitton bags, they bought perfume. Humans are an incredible species, but yes. So think about this, because some of you will have access to wealth, some of you will be extremely wealthy in the future. It may not appear like it now. All of you are just looking at me. And some of you will have some form of influence somewhere. I had a classmate who was not very smart, but he was one of the funniest guys I've ever met. And we had the chemistry teacher I told you about. He was a very mean chap. So he would mark and have the top marks to the bottom marks. And then he'd come during a lecture and flip over the papers. And he would start with the last one. He would read out all names and ask you to come collect your paper in front. And he'd say, oh, you. And this guy was almost always one of the first to be called. And one day when the chemistry teacher walked out, he said, relax, relax. You can be used even as an example in life. You're not useless. He went and started breeding dogs and made a lot of money. So people take different trajectories in life, but what I'm saying is everybody has a sphere of influence where they are, and we'll do an exercise after this to just show how different we are in class and where we can make a difference in our different ways. So there's investment and divestment. So investment is actively putting in money which will have certain positive outcomes. Divestment is pulling back money from industries or from ventures that are harmful. I showed you a video of the Danish oil and gas company that is now Oystel. That's an extreme example. But the other example now, and you can write down all the major international banks, the World Bank, IMF, IFC, EBRD, the Asian Development Bank, the Africa Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, all of them have announced that they are not funding at coal, and many of them will not fund oil and gas. So they will not fund fossil fuel ventures. But that's not enough. Saying we will not do that does not transform our energy system from one that's black, as someone said, to one that's green. So there must be a combination of all these factors: lobbying, investment, divestment, to ensure that we have outcomes that are correct. So,
but divestment as a process should necessarily be slow, is what I mean.
There's a point here that maybe we can debate, that divestment should be slow, is a question. Should divestment be slow? To divest from fossil fuel investment, should it be slow? Should it be done slowly?
No, once I think the other alternatives are better, maybe it can be like a fast process to divest.
Good, yes.
Also, like considering the amount of problems that they're causing, I think even if we start to take it slow, it will be slow because we have seen a lot of factors that are contributing to the transition. So anyways, we have to act fast as much as possible because the problem is like very
Thank you.
So, can you provide an example of
energy poverty in first world country, and how has government taken action using various laws, policies, and schemes to solve that?
I'll do that. Did someone have a comment on the previous question? Anyone else? Okay, energy poverty in developed countries comes in different forms. Number one, they cannot afford energy costs, so they cannot pay their bills. I'll give you the example of the US and the UK, where I have
Been and studied energy poverty. So they cannot simply afford, but they have extreme weather patterns. So there are programs that prevent utility companies from shutting off electricity. So that's a policy. You cannot shut electricity or heating in the winter. So that's a policy intervention. And the US especially has that policy being contributed to not just by central government, because that's where it comes from, then it goes down to the federal states, but the utility companies take a percentage of their revenue to put in a pool that then pays for the energy poor. But there are implementation problems. One of the implementation problems is, how do you classify somebody as energy poor? So they use broad metrics like you're on welfare. If you're on welfare, or if you don't have a job, if you're on social care, or if you're in social housing, the energy is free, at least for the time that you cannot afford it. That's one example. There are many problems, just so that I really would like you to understand the complexities of these things. Between changing jobs, I lived in a council flat. A council flat is basically, I wasn't on welfare, but I was as close to welfare as it comes. But I lived with someone who lived in social housing. And because it was social housing, none of the individual houses were allowed to modulate or regulate the temperature in the house. Heating came whenever it came and went whenever it went. For most of the winter, the houses were boiling. So, although the policy measure is intended not to cause problems, it was highly energy inefficient, and the houses were unlivable. So what do people do? They open all windows. If you open all windows, you then use ridiculous amounts of energy to just keep the thing going. So I have never seen worse use of at least heating than I have in the 2 months I lived in that council flat. And there is nothing people in the flat could do about it. That's one example. Another example of energy poverty is people in rural areas in developed countries. You would be amazed at how they live. I'll use the example of Romania because that's the one place my friend went, and Mekdes is smiling because she is supposed to be a Romanian. My friend went to Romania and took a video of rural Romania. It looked like rural Uganda. You know, the chickens were there. People were living exactly the way like I've seen in rural Uganda. In fact, he said, this really looks like Uganda. So when you think of developed countries, don't just think of people living the way they live in sitcoms. So an example of energy poverty there is what fuels do they use? They burn, they just hack trees down, or they light fires. So what interventions are there? I can use Scotland as an example. Houses that need better insulation, there are government programs that put double glazing to ensure that houses are more energy efficient and so on. And I can go on and on and on. But energy poverty is a global problem, and the poor get a disproportionate disadvantage wherever they are. This is a fact.